This whole theme of redefining a win is so critical for us because, sometimes we adopt what the world says a win should be. And it can get us frustrated. It can actually get us discouraged and really set us into a depression when we try to live up to other people's expectation of us or whatever we feel like the norm is. It can actually get us down. It can send us on a path of never feeling fulfilled or never feeling like we arrived or never getting to that finish line and crossing over thinking that I made it. Sometimes we try to make people feel wins are real minor things, real small goals. If we accomplish that, we win. And sometimes they're like impossible goals that only define win. But what we are doing in this series is from a biblical, scriptural perspective, trying to figure out what does a win mean for me? What's the win is the question that we're asking ourselves. What's the win? If a group of Christians gather together, you got to say, what's the win for this gathering? And it helps us understand our purpose, why we are meeting, why are we doing what we're doing. What's the win for a family? After everything said that, what's the win for a marriage? What's the win for this parenting season? What's the win? Now, the person that we're going to define this is the Apostle Paul. And we're studying the book of Philippians, and I hope that, I know I gave assignment last week to read through the book of Philippians and really study this out, really put this book in our hearts. We're going to go to the writer of this book, the Apostle Paul, who wrote the Philippian church, the Christians that were living in Philippi. Paul wrote this letter from really a dire position. It was a struggling position. Paul wrote this while he was in chains, while he was in prison. And in this letter, there's all kinds of struggles and hardships that he sees, but there's no other letter that has such a personal appeal from Paul. Paul uses the word I, me, my, all throughout this letter, more than any other letter per page. He talks about himself. So we get a good picture of who Paul is and who he was. This man who followed Jesus Christ over 2,000 years ago. Perhaps the greatest Christian that ever lived. Perhaps the greatest missionary, apostle. Definitely the most prolific church planter and biblical writer. So we get a chance to look into his mindset and discover what's the win from Paul's perspective. The book of Philippians is an amazing book. It has so many incredible, memorable verses that people memorize and place in their heart. Some of my favorite scriptures in the Bible are found here. And yet, if we look through this whole book, there's several hints that we can discover the behind-the-scenes challenges. One, Paul's in jail when he was writing it. Two, there are all kinds of Christian rivals that Paul was dealing with. Fellow, I don't even understand this. These were Christians who headed out. They were false, or they definitely were struggling because they viewed Paul as their rival, as their enemy. There's all kinds of, Paul was under the threat of a death sentence as he was awaiting trial. Another hint of the stresses and difficulties in this book was Paul had a sick friend, Epaphroditus. He was so sick that Paul thought he was going to die, and they were praying for him, but God had mercy on this minister, Epaphroditus. Another hint of the struggles in this book was just these evildoers that Paul described as enemies. And Paul would just say, he called them dogs, mutilators of their flesh at one point. We see that Paul had a couple of his different staff or co-workers or some women that worked along his side. They had some issues with each other. One's name was Yuda, another Sentici. They weren't getting along, and yet they both were faithful, strong Christians, but there was conflict within the body that Paul had to deal with. And finally, there are financial challenges that Paul had. See, back in the day when you were in prison, there was no government support system where they fed you. You had to be taken care of by your family and your friends and your neighbors. So in order for Paul to survive, he had to have people come in from the outside and give him food or give him money so that he can live. So with all of those challenges, what was Paul's mindset? What's the win? What's the win? If we ask Paul, what's the win? Paul would say, first of all, there's no greater joy that Paul had. In this letter, Paul says, he commands the people to rejoice over 5-6 times. He says, rejoice, rejoice, rejoice in the Lord always. Rejoice. So there's something about this man that understood what's the win. Especially if we think about the challenges that we have today in our own lives. It's obvious that every couple of years or so, our nation experiences a challenging time, internal conflicts often involving race, that exposes the unhealed wounds that we as a country carry. Division amongst his people. And even though the framers of the Constitution and Thomas Jefferson wrote these famous words, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are liberty, or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Even though these were founding documents that created a nation, boy, it seems like every generation experiences deeper divisions. Yep. From slavery to racism to different challenges that we have today, we have our own struggles. We have our own challenges. Evidenced by the shooting out there in Missouri that filled the airwaves. Young man, we don't know exactly what happened, but he was killed by a police officer. Now, he didn't seem like he had the best character in the world, but if you put your hands up, you shouldn't kill anybody. And at the same time, we see this division with the anger, with the protests of people looting and burning up property because of frustrations that are pent up, and that shouldn't be done either. So what's the win? How should we view? What should be our perspective behind these challenges? Even on a global scale, what's the win? What's the win in Ukraine as they're fighting an internal civil war, or in the Middle East where people are constantly at war? They've been at war in the Middle East for 5,000 years. What's the win? Is there anything in Paul's letter that we can pull out to be able to use in our personal lives, or even change our perspective and how we view the world? I think there are. And my first point is, Paul had a win-win mentality. Win-win. I love this phrase, win-win, because even when we are going through challenges, it's a win. And even if we are being encouraged, it's a win. Paul didn't say I'll only win when I'm feeling good or when I'm happy. That's the win. So even joy and happiness and great circumstances is greater than that. As a matter of fact, Paul, if we ask Paul would say, well, when I'm blessed, I win. And when I'm stressed, I win.